Speed has always been one of the greatest weapons of war. To take advantage of the enemy's unpreparedness, to travel by unexpected routes, and strike quickly where it is least expected, is a key to battlefield success. And throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, the speed with which technology has altered the machinery of war has been electrifying. From bolt-action rifles to machine guns that can deliver over 500 rounds per minute, the first jet fighters to long-range ballistic missiles, and the humble Jeep to the most advanced high-speed troop carriers, the capacity to shoot, move men, and strike with speed and flexibility is synonymous with modern warfare. This is the story of agility. Since they first appeared over the battlefield, the sheer wonder of flight has made aircraft perhaps the most glamorous of all the machinery of war. Machines that have continuously pushed the boundaries of technology in the quest for speed and agility. Modern fighter aircraft are designed to respond to threats quickly and effectively in situations where mere minutes can determine outcomes. They are the pinnacle of a quest for agility that began in World War I, a quest that appeared to have stalled during World War II, but one that gained new life in the dying days of the war with the introduction of a new power source, the jet engine. Introduced in 1944, the first jet-powered combat aircraft to enter service, the Gloucester Meteor, very nearly didn't get off the ground. The heat generated by the new turbojet engines were deemed beyond the bounds of metallurgical science of the period. But it did, and those engines, designed by Englishman Sir Frank Whittle, opened a new world of possibilities for aviation.
The turbojet engine was a dramatic change in design philosophy. The conventional piston engine was incredibly complex. We ended up with radial engines that were multi-rowed, even up to 4 rows. Heating was a problem. And then Frank Whittle designed this thing called the jet, which was so simple because it was all rotating basically on one shaft. They had a compressor at the front of the engine. It was, in its early days, incredibly simple.
The advantages of jet propulsion were many. More power was the most obvious, which allowed greater payloads. And in wartime, that translated to greater all-round attacking and defensive capability. While the combustion efficiency of jet engines gave them the ability to operate effectively at higher altitudes, importantly, jet power meant the Meteor could also maintain top speed at lower altitudes, something which piston-driven aircraft could not, which gave it the speed to catch the low-level V-1 flying bomb. The Meteor was in every way a record breaker. With a top speed of 960 kilometers per hour when it entered service, it was faster than anything that preceded it. And its excellent rate of climb of over 760 meters per minute made it possible to reach its service ceiling of 10,000 meters in as little as 12 minutes. While the Meteor design was not without issue, it served a greater purpose in advancing a technological cause. A cause the Harrier jump jet would take to another level. Speed is one aspect of agility in the air. Flexibility of purpose is another. As fighter aircraft increased their airborne capabilities, they also required increasingly large infrastructure to support their operations. To overcome these service limitations, the British came up with the Harrier, the only true vertical short takeoff and landing aircraft created during the Cold War. And with it came a new dimension in airborne agility.
It was an aircraft that was developed to remove reliance on runways. And so it could be operated right at the front of the combat arena.
What allows the Harrier to provide that frontline support directly from improvised bases, such as car parks and small flight decks, is a rather unique high bypass turbofan engine working with an ingenious engine vectoring system. 4 exhaust nozzles, 2 operating off the fan at the front of the engine and 2 off the exhaust at the rear, are used to direct a proportion of the overall thrust.
And it could swivel these exhaust nozzles from pointing backwards, which you would normally do on an aircraft, down to vertical, so that it could take off vertically if needed. It could land vertically, and even it could swivel them slightly forwards, thus moving the thrust vector and allowing it to maneuver quite differently than a normal aircraft.
This ability to vector thrust makes the Harrier capable of incredible maneuverability at speed in normal operations. Continuously revised and updated since it was introduced into operational service in 1969, the current Harrier II is an evolution of the original that has transformed the aircraft into a more versatile combat platform. No longer tied to basic close support sorties as its only forte, modern systems have given the Harrier combat capabilities that make it a premier ground strike aircraft with unparalleled attack helicopter-like agility that no conventional aircraft can match. But one thing it doesn't have is raw speed. Something the MiG-29 has in spades. As with so many weapons developed during the Cold War, the MiG-29 was designed to be the #1 air superiority fighter in the world. In this case, it meant it had to be faster and more maneuverable than the lightweight F-16, an aircraft with an impressive thrust-to-weight ratio that could perform radical maneuvers with surprisingly little energy loss. First flown in October 1977, the MiG-29 matched its competitor in almost every performance measurement. Both have top speeds of 2,400 kilometers per hour. Both have a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.09. But where they differ is in wing area. The MiG has 30% greater, and that makes it significantly more stable and maneuverable at lower speeds. Utilizing this super maneuverability, the MiG-29 can perform the highly complex Pugachev's Cobra, an aerial feat which would cause a conventional aircraft to stall and lose altitude rapidly. And while both can maintain sustained vertical flight, the MiG can achieve it surprisingly quickly after takeoff. And its capacity to maintain a very high angle of attack means that it climbs at an astonishing 330 meters per second, significantly quicker than the F-16. But as technology continued to alter the tactics on the battlefield, neither the F-16 nor the MiG-29 were ever truly tested as fighters in the way they were designed. Despite the end of the Cold War, both militaries continued to push the boundaries of aeronautical engineering. And when the Americans took the means of propulsion first used in the Meteor, added the aerodynamic agility and the speed of the MiG-29, the operational flexibility of the Harrier, and then installed the latest weapons and electronic systems, they created an aircraft that is beyond compare. The F-35B Lightning II. The basic concepts behind the F-35B were actually developed by Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works as a potential replacement for the Harrier over a decade ago. That idea was originally shelved, but it resurfaced as part of the Joint Strike Fighter program,
which then evolved into the F-35A, B and C. This was a design that was promised to be able to replace not just the Harrier, but a whole range of aircraft on a range of missions, both in the marine role of STOVL, of short takeoff and vertical landing, but also in the more traditional fighter and ground attack role for the US Air Force.
What has emerged is an aircraft that has all the attributes of a frontline strike fighter, but with the capacity for STOVL.
One of the three variants of the F-35, the F-35B, is a short takeoff and vertical landing aircraft, which can take off without the need for a dedicated large runway, but then you can have all the attributes of a fixed-wing aircraft in terms of speed and range during most of your flight. But then when you want to come back and land, then you can land vertically, again, without the need perhaps for that dedicated runway.
Which it does in a stealth package with a top speed in excess of twice the speed of sound.
The F-35B uses some of the ideas from the Harrier, but takes quite a different approach in terms of the propulsion system.
Unlike the Harrier, the F-35B incorporates a separate lift fan system, powered via a drive shaft from the front of the engine, which works in conjunction with the aft thruster. Operating in tandem, they can direct up to 80,000 newtons of thrust from the engine to the vertical in just 2.5 seconds. The F-35B also has the most complex electronic sensor package ever fitted to a fighter aircraft,
which allows the pilot, via the very sophisticated head-up system in the helmet, to basically look anywhere they like around the aircraft, through the walls of the aircraft, and see what is going on in various wavelengths, in the visible wavelength, but also in the infrared.
All of the sensor data is collected and passed via the latest generation communication systems to other assets in the field, optimizing the aircraft as a part of a bigger system, hugely increasing its effectiveness and ultimately the capacity to effectively prosecute that conflict. The sum of over 60 years of technological advancement in aviation, it is an example of the constant growth in the performance requirements of the machinery of war, brought about by new technologies and battlefield innovation. Innovation that hasn't just affected fighter aircraft design, but also the design of their larger cousins. To attack from long range and to limit your opponent's capacity for agility is crucial in modern warfare. For many years, heavy bombers were the most effective way to damage infrastructure and supply lines, to soften targets, and to give attacking forces the best chance of exploiting their offensive capabilities. But World War II saw rapid improvements in the performance of fighter aircraft and ground-based air defenses. So much so that by the middle of the war, the old adage that the bomber would always get through was being well and truly tested. Even the most heavily armed bomber squadrons began suffering crippling losses. But in the immediate post-war years, the jet engine, more powerful and crucially able to operate at higher altitudes, not only saved the bomber's reputation, but made it all the more deadly. First flown in 1949, the Canberra was the world's first jet-powered strategic bomber, and its advanced design completely changed the rules for long-range strategic air warfare.
It was built by a company called English Electric, or only a very small company. They came up with the design, which was a revolutionary design at that time.
It bears some resemblance to the Gloucester Meteor, but unlike the first jet fighter, it was built without any defensive armament and simply relied on its top speed, which was in excess of 960 kilometers per hour, to outrun fighters.
There was need for an aircraft that could fly at fairly low level and at high level. We knew there were going to be ground-to-air missiles coming about, and so the greatest defence was altitude.
The Canberra's clean aerodynamic design could approach altitudes of 21,000 meters, well beyond the range of ground-based deterrents. But it wasn't aerodynamics that gave it the edge. It was an all-new axial flow jet engine.
The Avon engine in the Canberra was a pure jet, and it just had one shaft, and all the compressor blades, 12 stages, they were all on that one shaft. And so you got lots of thrust out the back, and it kept the compressor working.
Produced by Rolls-Royce, the Avon engine was a turbojet based on the earlier designs of Sir Frank Whittle, but one that produced significantly more power than anything before it.
They were very good for high altitude work, and they became quite efficient with fuel. The wings were designed to carry fuel as well as bladders in the fuselage.
Those bladders gave the Canberra a range in excess of 5,500 kilometers. All in all, it was 3 times as quick, could fly 3 times as high, and go 30% further than the Avro Lancaster, the ubiquitous bomber of World War II that preceded it, carrying an only marginally lighter 4,500 kilogram payload.
So the Canberra could take off with a full bomb load, quite a lot of fuel, go in low, and if they couldn't deliver the weapons on the first pass, go to another target. And so the Canberra was a very successful aeroplane with the armament load that it had.
So well was the Canberra designed for its purpose that there was no need to replace it, and it remained active with the British, US, and Australian Air Forces for over 50 years. Whereas one of the aircraft that took over its role in the late 1950s, one of Britain's famous 3 V-bombers, flew only once in anger, almost 30 years after it was first commissioned. The Avro Vulcan. The British had always valued strategic bombers, but as the Cold War progressed and advances in surface-to-air missiles made Soviet airspace virtually impregnable, the requirements of a strategic bomber dramatically changed.
When the Cold War started to get really, really cold, the Americans put the heavies on the Brits and said, look, you've got to do your bit.
And what was needed to do that was something that could attack from outside hostile airspace.
The Vulcan, the one I flew on, carried a nuclear missile as opposed to a bomb.
That weapon was a missile called Blue Steel.
The Blue Steel missile could get an incredible range of 100 miles. You dropped it 100 miles away from the target.
Blue Steel was not a small weapon. Rocket science was in its infancy, and in order to deliver its 1.1 megaton warhead, it was over 10 meters in length and weighed over 7,700 kilograms, almost double the Canberra's payload. And to get within range to fire Blue Steel, the aircraft that delivered it would have to penetrate enemy lines at either great height or extreme low levels, and at high speed to avoid interception.
The Vulcan itself was a delta shape.
The delta wing design of an aircraft adds the capability of super high speed. The swept leading edges are more aerodynamic and allow the wing to go through the air a lot faster.
The delta wing housed the 4 engines, initially Rolls-Royce Avons that it shared with the Canberra. And as advances in engine technology progressed, the Vulcan was repeatedly upgraded. The original Avon engines produced nearly 30,000 newtons of thrust. In its final incarnation, its 4 engines each produced over 60,000 newtons of thrust, giving the Vulcan incredible all-round agility. Able to carry a payload of over 18,000 kilograms, retirement of the Vulcan was underway at the outbreak of the Falklands War in 1982. By that stage, it had been retrofitted with in-flight refueling capability, giving it theoretically unlimited range. Several aircraft were dispatched from Ascension Island to attack the Argentinians in the Falklands. A round trip of over 12,000 kilometers, or 16 hours. One that stood for many years as the longest operation ever undertaken by military aircraft. While speed and agility is vital to prevent interception in the air, on the ground, it is the key to reinforcing an offensive advantage. And in World War I, the race to create faster firing, lighter, and more easily handled personal weapons began with the design of an efficient bolt-action rifle, the short-magazine Lee Enfield. In 1914, during the Battle of Mons in southern Belgium, a relatively small British expeditionary force, armed with Lee Enfields, fired on the German First Army.
It was assumed by them that the British were heavily armed with machine guns because of the rate of fire which was coming their way from the highly trained British Expeditionary Force.
Those British soldiers at Mons had been trained in a new way. And part of that more intense training included an annual test known as the Mad Minute. To pass, 15 shots had to be fired at a target almost 300 meters away within a minute.
Which is, out of a bolt-action rifle which only holds 10 rounds, is phenomenal. Gives you an idea of the skill set required to make that happen.
To achieve accuracy with a high rate of fire, combined with mobility, required an efficient, manageable rifle. And so everything about the Smelly, as it became referred to, was designed to optimize speed and agility. It was a rifle of carbine length, and at just 1 meter, it was easy to handle. It was comparatively light at 4.5 kilograms, and had a 10-shot magazine, which was larger than its competitors. What set the SMLE apart, though, was its rear-locking bolt, which meant far less travel and far quicker reloading. Over 5 million Lee Enfields were produced and saw service for much of the 20th century. But in the interwar years, the British, in pursuit of greater mobility, decided to create a weapon that had the brute strength of a heavy machine gun that could be operated by a single man. The Bren gun.
The Bren gun was a light machine gun that was introduced into British Army service in the mid-1930s. And it's called the Bren because it was developed in Brno, which was in Czechoslovakia, now Slovakia, and it was built in Enfield, so B-R-E-N. And it became the most common British Commonwealth weapon of the entire war, and indeed of the world.
The first thing to note about the Bren is its weight, which at 11.5 kilograms is light for a gun of its power. What that meant was that while generally fired from the prone position, the Bren could also be fired from the shoulder with an accuracy comparable to that of a bolt-action rifle. A Bren gunner could also use his weapon on the move, firing from the hip, supported by a sling much like an automatic rifle, creating heavy suppressing fire during a forward assault.
It had a high rate of fire. It was 500 rounds a minute, but it only had a 30-round magazine, so it fired typically in short bursts, so it was quite economical to use.
And because the magazine was on the top, it could be quickly changed on the move.
So every man in a squad would be carrying a number of spare magazines to keep this hungry beast fed.
It was often used by a two-man team, one to fire, the other to reload and act as a spotter.
Each section of the British Army, and indeed Commonwealth armies, the Canadians, the Australians and New Zealanders, all structured their infantry sections around the gun group of these two men who would provide the organic fire support for the other 6 or 8 men in the section to do their job.
That second man was also responsible for handling an operation that kept the barrel cool and made the design of the Bren revolutionary.
By flipping a catch and by using the carrying handle, you could very quickly change the barrel in action, which meant that there would be no delay. You didn't have to wait for it to cool down. So the Bren's robustness was one of its best features.
The Bren's adaptability and portability meant that it could be distributed widely across infantry battalions. By the middle of World War II, the British were producing 1,000 Brens per week, allowing them to equip every infantry section, a group of 8 to 10 men in every single battalion, with its own light machine gun.
So in a sense, the Bren is at the heart of the tactics the British Commonwealth used to win the war.
But as World War II progressed, tactics and understanding of battlefield realities changed.
The assault rifle, as we understand it today, really emerges in World War II. Certainly the name assault rifle comes from the German Sturmgewehr, storm rifle, assault rifle, for that assault phase of an attack, or for trench fighting, or for urban combat. But the Kalashnikov, or the AK, as it's more commonly known, arguably perfects it.
The AK-47 was not the first assault rifle, but it embodied the best attributes of various earlier designs to create a weapon of extreme agility. Its gas-operated self-loading system was pioneered by the German Storm rifle. Its trigger mechanism is from the US M1 Garand, and its safety mechanism is a direct copy of that used on the Remington Model 8. But the Kalashnikov embraced other factors in its design to create the most agile and long-lived of all assault rifles. The first factor was climate. The AK-47 is made to operate efficiently in the same extreme conditions encountered during the war on the Russian front, where the dusty steppes of summer became frozen wastelands in winter. The second was reliability.
The way the Russian state has manufactured equipment, it's always been extraordinarily robust, which means it can take an awful lot of abuse and still work.
What's interesting about the AK-47 is that a child can maintain it. You can drop it into a swamp, pick it out, and you can very easily disassemble it and clean it up. It's got relatively few components compared to certain assault rifles. And so that is why it was so extensively used.
The third is flexibility. Kalashnikov can act as a semi-automatic or full automatic, depending on the battlefield circumstances, simply by moving a switch and pulling the trigger. It was and continues to be a rapid-firing people's weapon, designed for ease of use, one that can be quickly mastered by peasants and trained soldiers alike. And as such, it became the most highly produced and widely used personal infantry weapon of the 20th century. The introduction of powered vehicles revolutionized warfare. Machines like the tank, a self-propelling artillery piece with all-terrain capability, was one of the many technical advancements of World War I that meant World War II would be faster and far more mobile than any war that had preceded it. By taking the driveline principles of the tank, fitting it with a lightly armored skin and a powerful V8 engine, then arming it with a heavy caliber machine gun, the British created one of the most ubiquitous weapons of the war, the universal carrier. An extraordinarily agile battlefield workhorse.
The universal carrier is a very lightly armored tracked vehicle. It comes out of the fact that through the 1920s and 30s, European armies had fallen in love with the tank and were developing tanks to fight the next war.
The universal carrier was in essence an armored tractor. And as if to prove its universality, steering was through a wheel as opposed to the levers found in other tracked vehicles, which meant virtually anyone could drive it with limited training.
It's called universal because it can do lots of things. It can transport men, it can transport supplies, it can tow guns, and it was used all over the world to do that.
Powered by a Ford V8 engine, across the battlefield in any conditions, it was both agile and, for its time, quick, with a top speed of 56 kilometers per hour.
Tracked vehicles are able to traverse terrain which is extremely boggy and is able to get to they're able to get to locations that wheeled vehicles simply cannot get to.
The body was a simple steel box with a motor compartment situated in the center. In front sat a driver, and alongside him a gunner, usually operating the famous Bren light machine gun, which turned it into a highly mobile light attack vehicle.
And as the war went on, it was equipped with flamethrowers and mortars and all sorts of things to enable it to transport and fight on the battlefield.
With over 100,000 produced, it may have been one of the most ubiquitous, versatile, and agile weapons platforms of World War II. But when we turn our minds to the vehicles that defined World War II, it's not one of British manufacture that we think of. It's American. Any mental picture of World War II would be incomplete without the presence of at least one Willie MB, the vehicle better known as the Jeep. U.S. General George C. Marshall called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare, and it would see service with all of the Allied forces, Russians, British, and Anzacs in all theaters. Ultimately, over 600,000 would be produced by the end of World War II alone. Adaptable like the universal carrier, the Jeep was put to work in tasks as wide-ranging as a mobile mortar platform, artillery towers, a field ambulance, and just about everything in between. It was the personification of battlefield flexibility and agility. The Humvee is the natural inheritor of the Jeep legacy. A high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, the Humvee began life as a project to find a single vehicle that could be used to perform a multitude of functions in combat.
A Humvee is effectively a Jeep replacement. It's a four-wheeled vehicle, that's the main variant, that is able to transport troops very quickly from one location to the other.
For nearly 30 years, the Humvee has been the workhorse of militaries across the globe. And like its predecessor, it has achieved iconic status as one of the most recognizable vehicles on the planet. It can operate on 40% of side slope, climb a 60% slope, ford 1.5 meters of water, and is fast enough to keep up with the Abrams tank. Despite its size, 1.8 meters high, 2.1 meters wide, and 4.5 meters long, like the Jeep, the Humvee is a relative lightweight, tipping the scales at 2,600 kilograms. But what really sets it apart from the Jeep is its cabin, which offers full occupant protection. And to achieve the low weight necessary for high-speed agility and soldier safety, that cabin is largely constructed of aluminium.
And what we find with aluminium alloys is that for lighter weight vehicles, ballistically, they generally perform better than high-strength steels. But that can come with its own difficulties.
Seeing service in the Middle East during the First Gulf War, the Humvee proved to be the ultimate in agility and adaptability. But war is constantly changing. The widespread introduction of IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, have made the lightly built Humvee vulnerable. and a replacement is on the way. A replacement designed to protect the occupants from not just IEDs, but also weapons like HIMARS. The purpose of HIMARS is to clear a path for infantry, tanks, and traditional artillery by engaging and destroying virtually any enemy asset within its target area. It does this by launching its weapons at a distance, after which it moves away from the area at speed before enemy forces locate the launch site. Featuring a 6-shot Mars rocket launching module attached to the flatbed of a modern multi-purpose heavy truck. At 7 meters long, 2.4 meters wide, and with a height of just 3.2 meters, the HIMARS is remarkably compact, given its destructive capability. In a typical mission, HIMARS would travel at over 85 kilometers per hour to a designated launch location, where a command and control post would transmit selected target data to the onboard launch computer. The computer then aims the launcher and provides prompts to the crew to arm and fire a pre-selected number of rounds, a sequence that takes just 16 seconds. Firing an array of guided missiles with ranges up to 100 miles. Most rockets fired by HIMARS carry a payload of several hundred anti-material grenades, which are dispersed over the target in mid-air and detonate on impact, destroying or disabling all enemy assets in the designated area. HIMARS is an incredibly agile modern expression of a weapon that, prior to World War II, lived solely in our imaginations: the missile. Missiles are the ultimate in agile attack weapons. Ones that leave an enemy with little time to defend or respond. And the faster the missile, the harder it is to destroy. What's more, they can be launched with a flick of a switch, delivering a massive payload without any human risk to the operator. All sides in World War II were looking at rockets of one kind or another. But it was the Germans who took what were, at the time, storybook musings and created a most agile and deadly reality. A reality that would change the face of modern warfare. A long-range pilotless flying bomb that in World War II was accompanied by a sound that would live in the minds of the British for decades. The Treaty of Versailles, signed after World War I, forbade the defeated Germans from developing any new artillery weapons. But it said nothing, however, of rockets. With Hitler's rise and a determination that technology would win the next war, the Germans committed huge resources to the development of rocket-powered weaponry. They called them vengeance weapons. The V-1 was a pilotless jet-powered plane with an explosive warhead. Over 8 meters long and with a wingspan of over 5 meters, it was launched by igniting its pulse engine and firing it on a sled up an inclined ramp 36 meters long. The V-1 was then thrown into the air in much the same way that an aircraft carrier launches planes. Once airborne, it simply continued toward its target in the same direction it was launched, using a preset magnetic gyro compass.
The V-1 Doodlebug is guided by gyroscopes and a flight termination system basically running on a timer. So it will fly a particular time in a particular direction, and then it will dive at the ground and explode.
Initially designed to power into the ground, a fault in the fuel system of the V-1's engine caused it to cut out as it dived.
And of course, there's stories around London of people knowing that they were about to have a V1 attack when you heard the pulse jet go across the sky and then cut out. And you knew that some short time later it would be impacting somewhere in the city.
And when it did, it was devastating. The Doodlebug, or Buzzball as it became known, carried a 1-ton warhead that was detonated by immediate action fuses on impact, sending its blast outwards across the surface. Over 4 months, more than 9,000 were launched, primarily at London, with devastating effect. But the V1 had a range of just 321 kilometers. And by late 1944, Allied advances in Europe, along with sustained bombing, had destroyed and pushed back its launch sites, making London safe from the Buzzball. But worse was to come. As the war turned decidedly in the Allies' favor, the Germans took one last technological roll of the dice and introduced a supersonic weapon that could neither be tracked, intercepted, nor chillingly heard.
The V2 is probably best described as the first ballistic missile. Many of the technical innovations that were necessary to build a useful rocket were solved by Wernher von Braun and the German design team with the V2.
First launched in September 1944, the V2 was a potent, destructive weapon designed to breed terror in civilian populations. It succeeded, and it also killed thousands, with over 3,000 fired at England, Belgium, and France in a 6-month reign of terror, before the Allies overran their launch sites in early 1945. A silent killer, it was also a scientific marvel, one that would change the course of humanity.
The V2 was the first man-made object that actually reached the boundary of space, which we normally define to be 100 kilometres above the Earth's surface. And they actually did that during the Second World War, arguably at the point where they're on the point of losing as well. So quite a technical achievement.
The most fundamental hurdle that needed to be solved to build a useful rocket was the development of a method for combining liquid fuel and oxygen under sufficient pressure to generate the required thrust. To do this, they designed turbopumps powered by household chemicals like hydrogen peroxide. Simple bleach that mixed and compressed the fuel before it was driven at pressure into the firing chamber. A principle that is central to rocket propulsion systems to this day. While it terrified the Allied nations, the V2 had a relatively small effect on the war. Its primitive guidance system didn't allow it to strike strategic objectives such as bridges, factories, or airfields. But it was perhaps the most astounding technological development of the war. And like so much German World War II technology, V2 rockets and scientists captured at the end of the war would form the basis of US and Russian missile programs that would, very quickly, change the world forever.
At the end of the war, von Braun was captured by the Americans. He was an SS officer. But pragmatic politics, the Americans decided not to prosecute, to bring him home and use him as an engineering leader.
Given the relative immaturity of ballistic missile technology, neither Russia nor the US achieved usable ballistic missiles immediately after the war. Both had atomic weapons, but in the late 1940s and early 50s, most of the competition between the two countries revolved around gravity bombs delivered by strategic bombers. But the race for supremacy was forever changed by the events of 1952, with the successful full-scale test of a workable hydrogen bomb.
The power of these weapons was very scary for them at the time. Both the Russians and the Americans ended up running experiments and test detonations where the yield was much higher than they expected.
With both countries in possession of H-bomb technology, the race was on to find a way to deliver the warhead. And when in 1957, the Soviets launched a multi-stage ballistic missile, as well as the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, the Americans quickly responded with the SM-65 Atlas, the world's first nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missile. More than simply an Americanized vengeance weapon, the Atlas was designed to fly in excess of 10 times the range of a V-2, 5,500 kilometers from the United States to strike at the heart of the Soviet Union. On its parabolic journey, it would fly between 150 and 400 kilometers into space, from where the warhead, separated from the main stage rocket, would transition in orbit until it plunged back to Earth and exploded over the desired target. A large task, and given that the heavier the rocket, the more power required to launch, huge efforts were made to trim its bulk. Even so, the Atlas at 25 meters high weighed over 108 tons, and like the V-2 and many rockets to this day, much of that weight was its propellant, a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen. It proved to be a definitive design.
Intercontinental ballistic missiles and space rockets have almost identical types of characteristics, and so the Atlas still sees service today, basically into the 2000s.
The Atlas was the first stage in a dangerous game of brinkmanship, and was produced in sufficient numbers that, had they been fired, we would be living in a very different world today. But such was the paranoia that surrounded the Cold War. Obvious deterrents were not enough to stop development. The fear amongst Americans was that if they were attacked, the Atlas would be too slow to respond.
So one of the problems with a nuclear war such as they envisaged in the Cold War is that it's incredibly destructive. There is the risk that if somebody starts a war, then it will very quickly get out of hand and you'll end up with a bloodbath on both sides, with most of the belligerent countries' territory destroyed and most of their population dead. The concern was, how do you stop this scenario from happening? How do you stop someone from starting a nuclear war?
The solution was immediate launch capability. Enter the Minuteman. The Minuteman was so named because, like its colonial namesake, it could respond immediately to threat. But to respond to the press of a button required solid fuel.
One of the normal problems with rockets is that they're all liquid-fueled. The problem with that is liquid propellants. You can only hold them in the rocket for a short period of time before you have to remove them and probably refurbish the rocket to make up for the fact that it's been fueled, which means they're not a very good deterrent because you can't keep them in a ready-to-launch state. But the Minuteman brings forward a solid rocket propellant, which means that it can sit in the silo ready to go at a moment's notice, and they don't degrade very much over time, so 15 to 20-year lives are not unusual.
Rapid advances in solid fuels left just the question of accuracy.
The other revolutionary part of the design was the navigation system.
To fly a ballistic trajectory and hit a designated target demands a very accurate inertial navigation system that uses gyroscopes spun up and aligned to the Earth's rotation.
And there's not time to do that. It might take anywhere up to half an hour for that gyroscope to align. So consequently, with the Minuteman, the gyroscope's already spun up, ready to go.
With its underground silos able to withstand a nuclear blast, retaliation was guaranteed. The epitome of agility and the ultimate stalemate weapon. If the Minuteman is ever truly fired, what is certain is that both sides will lose.